Welcome, welcome. Also, I need to introduce a couple that's here. A week and a half ago, we got honored to go to a wedding. It was real quick. And so, David and Erica Grimm, congratulations. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, so what an honor to be invited. So, blessings on you guys. Welcome. Let's start with a prayer and then roll up the sleeves because we're going to dive into conflict today. So, yeah, if anybody needs to stretch or something beforehand, maybe exit. Okay, there's the rabbits. Everybody that doesn't want to deal with conflict. Okay, let's pray. Do we have any rib guards? You had to bring your own. You didn't get the email? Sorry about that. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your presence and your love. And how it continually shines through. Father, may we see it more and more in our relationship with you and in our relationship with each other. Well, Father, we just give you this time. We ask for your spirit to move freely, and we consecrate the conversation and the dialogue that happens tonight to you. Through Jesus' name, pray. Amen. So just to kind of start off, I'm curious if you guys are willing with this dialogue part. In your relationships, whether it be marriage or friendships that are important, or family that happens quite a bit too, what are, over the history of your life together with whoever these people are that you're thinking of, what are some of the more silly arguments that you have that come up? The dishwasher, okay? Yeah, and again, I realize this is a continuum because to some people, a silly argument is an incredibly serious one to the other person or to other couples. Because I know too well about the dishwasher from hearing clients that it is a moral issue on how the dishwasher is to be loaded and unloaded because otherwise nothing gets clean. And it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to try to talk you off that position necessarily. Yes, ma'am. Okay. There's a specific way to make tuna fish salad. Okay. Okay. Well, that's up there. Origin family tradition? Oh, like traditions and how they... and how we're supposed to do it. This was a story I had from a client long ago who fits that story. It wasn't for a family tradition as far as a holiday, but I was raised in a family where roast was done a lot on Sunday morning, right? So you set up the crock pot, you leave for church, you come home, it smells like roast, because that was the way my grandmother set up. But I had a client that she was going to make a pot roast, and she didn't do it with a crock pot. She did it in a pan in the stove, and so she called her mom. What do I need to do with pot roasting? So mom told her, well, you cut the ends off and you season it and you put it in. Like, okay, so she did that, and her husband comes in and goes, what? I don't understand. This is what mom said. So she calls mom, why is that recipe the way it is? Well, that's just what mom taught me. So grandma. So she calls grandma, who was still alive. Grandma, why do we cut the ends off the roast? Because the pan, it wouldn't fit in the pan. And it got passed down that that's the way you cook pot roast. Can you see how that's ripe with a conversation about conflict? Because to the person looking at us going, what? That makes no sense at all. Anything else? Come on, we all have silly arguments. How to make the bed. Or do you even make the bed? Right, because there's the argument of, I'm going to get back in it in 12 hours or however long. Oh, wait, a made bed means a non-stinky room. I'm trying to follow that logic for a second. Because the comforter covers up the stench? Help me out, I'm not sure. Okay. How to squeeze toothpaste? No, see, now that's kind of, now we're treading on some rough waters possibly. Yeah. Toilet paper, does it go over or under? And everybody knows the biblical way is over. Beards, not mullets. What? Beards, not mullets. Okay. Anything else? When to use hot and cold water? Will you guys come up and teach the class? Okay. Okay. So, I mean, obviously, if you think about it, a lot of what we're discussing here when you're talking about conflict, none of us are immune to it, right? It happens because you have a preference, you have a tradition, you have stuff that's been passed down, you have things that are just, this is the way we do it. And then you married somebody that's like, you are ridiculous. You and your whole family are ridiculous. And so who's right in this argument? Yeah, both of you. And none of you is probably the easiest way to describe that. Because what I think is happening, actually, what I want to talk about with the idea of conflict is it's exposing something about ourselves and each other. Because there's a bigger thing going on. Because the last couple of times we've met, we've been talking about the idea of trying to learn to love. And how when things get exposed and I get anxious, it's incredibly difficult then to love. Because if I'm anxious about something, or if I'm unsure about something, or if I'm scared about something, often what I want to do is just make that feeling go away. And so there's a couple of different ways we'll do that. Like when I'm anxious about something, and if I want somebody else to help me feel better about me, there's 4 different ways we're going to do this, okay? And this is a partner-regulated approach to anxiety. If those of you are taking notes, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So if I'm wanting somebody else to help me feel better, I will do one of 4 things, okay, when I'm anxious about stuff. One is I will demand. And it'll have to be my way. And most of the times, my demands are just based on all of the things we've been talking about so far. Preferences, traditions, the way we do it, the way I like it. I just prefer it this way. Because if you look at the levels of cleanliness in people's homes and how we all struggle with what those mean, I mean, anybody have a kid whose level of cleanliness matches your own? Okay. In a bad way. Care to elaborate? Oh, okay. They're equally messy. Now I follow. I was like, I did not catch where you were going with that. Okay. So, but there's this element of my demands that I make are oftentimes, I just want you to act in a certain way because then I won't feel so uncertain or anxious or vulnerable. Okay, so demand is one. The other is conform. I just go along. I just conform. I just blend in with whatever the conflict is. And this is something that happens a lot in marriages over some of the things that we fight about that are really kind of silly. And it's kind of like, whatever. Okay. I mean, my go-to move on how I conform is, okay. And that's kind of, I'm throwing the white flag, not worth fighting about. But what's bad about that move is the worst in me will then come around later and want that to be accounted for or made up for, or I will get my way some other way. Because in essence, what I can become is a slightly more sophisticated toddler or middle schooler, where it's about getting my way to make sure I feel better or okay, rather than, no, that tension is just the differences between us. The third one is I can withdraw or disengage. This is also the idea of stonewalling. I just disconnect completely. There's issues that need to be talked about, and one of you probably is not excited to talk about it, so you would be the withdrawer in that situation. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I don't want to deal with it. And those of you that just did elbows, I saw them. Yeah, you're just stretching? Okay. And then the last one, the fourth one is I can distract or numb myself from it. I just don't even face it. This is where I oftentimes will turn to TV, social media, games, other things that just kind of help me feel like I don't have to face what life is. Because that's the one thing that's so interesting about marriage and about important relationships is I say and I know deep down through all of my being, it is an important relationship. It matters. I care about it. But yet, when it comes to the tension that we have, I can act like I don't care about it. And now we're both in a dilemma. Because if you guys ever had a time where an issue comes up in your relationship, you don't engage, what does your partner do in that regard? Do they go, oh, I wonder if they just don't want to face this right now? I wonder what could be going on with them. Maybe it's a good idea we don't talk about it right now because maybe they're seeing something that's better for us to not have to face right now. No, that is not what we typically do. What do we typically do? Turn into a chihuahua? That works too. Okay? We attack it. We go overboard. We push and we push and we push. And what happens in that scenario, what does a withdrawer do when they're being pushed? Withdraw more. And so then it becomes this vicious cycle. I mean, there's a psychological terminology out there of the pursuer-distancer framework, where one person's pursuing it constantly, while the other one's distancing it. And what's interesting is oftentimes, whatever one I comprise in that dynamic is I can think that's the right one. I'm pursuing it. I care about this. This is important. I need to pursue it. And so I therefore have high ground, when maybe not. Because if all I'm really trying to do is help myself feel better, do I really have high ground? Am I really facing the issue? Because what happens in relationships and what things get exposed, there's nothing going wrong. Okay? That's what I fully believe. When I have conflict with people I care about, there's nothing going wrong. Because we all have conflict with a variety of instances in our lives. You pull in through a drive-through, you order, you get home, and it's not the right thing. That's conflict. Because what do? You go back, or you're not. I've had clients actually that I actually tried to encourage them to order something when it came. I realize this is dicey, but when their order came, to say it was the wrong order, just to create conflict, to see how they can handle it. Because most of the time in that scenario, a waiter or waitress bends over backwards to try to fix it. That's their job. They don't take it personal. So you can't really manufacture something like that in a personal relationship because people do take it personal. Right? But I also will do it that way because what I ultimately hope happens is they tell me no, they won't do it. Because what are they just doing right now with me? Creating conflict with me. That's the point. You can do it and you can handle it. And it's realizing most of us, when it comes to conflict management or conflict avoidance, we really just don't want to face it. There are some people that are really, really charged with conflict. They love it. But then there's a lot of people that would probably be more in my camp of I'm conflict averse. I just don't like it. I don't want to face it. But the reality is when I live among human beings, I'm going to have conflict. And when we have a marriage or we have an important relationship, we have to realize conflict is what creates the container for our growth like nothing else can. Because when I'm coming up against something with somebody I care about, I'm now faced with what happens in this dilemma, what happens in this dynamic. Because we can get to where if I follow it through, If I actually got my way, did I really accomplish anything? Think of the silly arguments. If you got your way, did you really accomplish anything? I mean, can you go to bed at night going, yes? Oh, yeah? Okay. Thank you for the honesty, because I think we all can do this, because I think secretly all of us in our homes have scoreboards. And sometimes it comes down to who's winning from the day. And when I look at it that way, I start to realize that's not really a relationship based entirely on love. There's elements, absolutely, but there's other aspects where it's not. Because what I really believe when we're talking about conflict and when we're talking about the differences between us is that our ability to love isn't exposed until our differences show up. Because if we get along real well, that's a kind of a cool, comfortable feeling. But if you've had so those of you that have been in a relationship for a length of time where you've had highs and lows and then highs again. So when you get along really well, it's kind of like, sweet, this is good. I like this. This is easy. It's kind of, there's not a whole lot of energy needed. There's just kind of an easy flow, right? And that's a good thing. But if you've had highs and lows and highs and lows and highs and lows, and now all of a sudden you're in a state where we're like getting along really well, do you have an element in the back of your head just hoping the other shoe doesn't ever drop? Knowing, oh, here we go. And because a lot of times what I can think happens, this is the way I can react at times too, is I get a rhythm going, and then the bottom drops out, and I think, well, nothing's changed. Because what's interesting is that's an overreaction to a reaction. Because that's just what happens with a dynamic. And so what I want to try to talk about tonight is this idea of what do I need to do when there's conflict happening, when there's stuff being exposed in me, because it's counterintuitive. Because I think God is a God of paradox. And I think one of those things he is he wants us, he'll talk about love, and he'll talk about giving, and he'll talk about sacrifice, and it's still an element, there's a paradox in it of how he's describing it. Because I think what he's saying actually is, if I'm facing an opportunity to love in the midst of conflict, that means I've got to face that conflict. I've got to move towards it while not giving up on myself in the midst of it. Because when you get in really, really tense moments, is anybody else like me that just wants the tension to stop? Knowing full well I'm going to have to wake up and still have tension. But I just want the tension to stop. So the paradox becomes, how do I turn towards it and move into it? And so there's a couple of ways that I think that matter on this if we're starting to talk about what's being exposed in me. And the first one is, when I have conflict over anything, is oftentimes one of the best things I need to do is learn to wait. Ask myself, why am I taking this so personal? Because I really believe, and I'll say this to a lot of clients, I really believe what happens in our relationships is we take things too personally. Which that's a paradox in and of itself, too, isn't it? This is the most personal relationship we should have, so why shouldn't I take it personal? Rather than, no, I think we take things too personal, and so I need to learn to not be as reactive, so then I can be more personal. Because I've talked about this a couple weeks ago, that I made the idea of the closer you get to somebody, the more you're going to find things about them and yourself that you're not necessarily going to like initially. You guys remember that? So, because something's being exposed about our dynamic, about each of us, about myself. You know, the classic one you hear is, one of the things I'll ask a lot of times when I'm speaking to a group is, what surprised you most about marriage? And a lot of them will say, I never knew how selfish I was until I got married. Because when you're on your own, you don't have something coming back at you. There's a proverb that I don't remember what chapter it's in, but there's a proverb that talks about the first thing you say is true until a witness comes along later to refute what you said. Because that's basically saying we all believe our own story until something comes back to disprove it. Which there's actually an interesting, cool study out there. There's some flashbulb memories. So if you think of a couple of different instances that have happened, these are shock moments that have happened in our world. When the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded was one. 9/11 was one. But there was a Challenger study that there was some professors up in New York that the day after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in 1983, 86. Yes, we'll go there. 86, 83. One of us is right. Let's say both. I like that, how that feels. So the day after, they had their students, 106 students in their personal development as a psychology class. They had them write out, where were you, what were you doing, and who were you with when you got the news. And then the professors gathered it up and they filed it away. And then a year later, 5 years later, and 10 years later, they revisited those kids to had them write it again. Where were you? Who were you with? And what were you doing? And what's interesting is 5 years, 10 years later, over 50% of them did not have the same memory of what they wrote the first time. And 10 years later was even higher than that. And the reason is because we are fallible human beings in the way our memories work. We like to think we are steel traps. And there are some that are. But a majority of us, we have emotions attached to it, and it changes things. And we have these time slice errors where we misremember something, but to us, it is guaranteed truth. Because when they came back 10 years later, there was one girl that they gave her the paper of what she wrote, and she read it, and she's like, no, that's my handwriting, but I did not write this. She was so convinced that what she had written 10 years earlier was not the truth because her memories had shifted. And now take that over into the way we argue. When we know we're right, are we? Maybe. Maybe not. And so it's recognizing there's a dilemma that is at play that I love the idea. I don't like going through it, but I love the idea of the mechanism at play. It's exposing something in me to where, hold on a sec, maybe I'm holding on to something that I don't need to be so right about. Because the other phrase I will use on our podcast at times over the years is, if I have to always be right, well, then that means I'm married to somebody that's a loser. And who wants to be married to a loser? Well, apparently I do, because that's the stances I can take. I realize that's just shock value podcast talk, but there's an element of realize, what am I fighting about? What is this really about? Is this about me, or is it about a dynamic that's going on between us? Okay, so one is waiting, the other is self-soothing, which I've talked about before, which is this idea of asking myself good questions. How do I calm myself down? How do I soothe my own anxiety? And I mentioned this a couple of weeks back. When you feel anxiety, you guys remember this conversation of how do you feel it? And if you stick your bottom jaw out and take deep breaths, that helps open your throat. If you're really anxious, because our throat will tighten. If you stick your jaw out, you can take deep breaths quickly, which calms us down. It's just a quick little trick that can help. But the other thing is, take some breaks, go on walks. Pam and I have adopted the strategy of, when we have tense things to deal with, we oftentimes go walking to talk about it. Because it puts us in public, it makes us move, and it makes us so we're not looking at each other. I'm letting that sink in. Right? Because where is the majority of communication communicated through? Nonverbals, your tone and your body language carry 93% of the conversation. And so sometimes if you're fighting about something really, really important, intense in your marriage or in your family or in your life, one of the worst things you can do is sit across from each other and look at each other while you're talking about it. Because you'll be reading each other and reacting. I used to hate speaking when Pam was in the audience. Because I would say something and I would see her shift, and then in the back of my head I'm going, what did I just say? Now I'm in trouble. When in reality, her back just hurt. And she was moving, or she had to burp, or something. I mean, it had nothing to do with me. But we read each other and we react to each other, which then further exacerbates conflict. So a lot of times, if I can just learn to soothe myself and find strategies that help. And so I love the idea of the walk and talk. I think I might have even mentioned in here, sometimes we will go on a walk and we don't turn around and start heading home until we've started cooling down a little bit with the tension between us. And so sometimes we get several miles in on those walks, which is really, we got a good workout. Sweet. Maybe. There's a lot of tension though still. But there's a beautiful analogy to that and metaphor of it. I even had a client, one of my office I used to have was up in Adriatica, where they have the lake that's around. And before they built the big, huge houses, you could walk around that lake, or parts of it at least. And there was a couple that I was working with that they started walking. And I loved it because one of the times they talked about, they went on a walk around the lake and they're talking, and then it got really tense. And one of them just stopped, but the other just kept on walking a little bit. They slowed down, but they kept on walking. And rather than the person that stopped watching their spouse walk away, they didn't freak out. They actually told themselves, wait, we're going the same way. We'll end up at the same house. That's okay. And so they kind of calmed themselves down, and then they started walking again. And I'm like, so did you ever catch up? Yeah, at the house. Because they used the time separate to kind of work through where each of them were on the thing. Because isn't it difficult sometimes to keep our heads straight in the midst of real tense, heated emotion? And I don't mean volume. I just mean heated emotion. Things that scare us, things that I'm unsure about, things that I don't know. I freak out most when presented with something I don't know or understand. It'll just kind of, there's just parts of me like I just pull way, way back. And a lot of that is fueled by my tendency to want to be thought of as smart. And so now all of a sudden what just got exposed here is, I don't know. Therefore, I'm not smart. Which is, I think, a little bit of an overreaction, but there's still an element in there. Follow? Okay. The other one, the third point on this, if we're talking about facing anxiety, facing conflict, is to embrace the discomfort. Embrace the tension. Move into it. Realize it's important. Anxiety is real, but it won't kill you. And even if it just means I'm honest about, I'm not at a place to talk about this for a moment, but I know it matters. That's better than the other dodges and deflects that we often are oh so keen to do. Fair? Okay, and then the last one is, this is the opportunity to love. This helps us learn how to love, how to turn towards somebody and keep coming back. Because think about it. Those of you that have been married or in any kind of a committed relationship or important relationship that you've seen progress and change, did that just come from one conversation? No. It comes from multiple. Sometimes the one conversation actually pivots you and gets you on a much better path, and then it's now different tension because of what you're facing. But a lot of times we're talking about endurance, we're talking about sticking with it, we're talking about leaning into a process and showing and demonstrating this is important, this matters too. And I see who I'm with, I see how they respond. Okay, are you guys doing okay? Okay. There's a couple of facial expressions I'm not quite sure what to do with. Okay. Oh, I didn't realize she was that good a ventriloquist. Okay. Well, I mean, I think one of the things I love about this whole framework is I think it applies to every relationship I'm in. It's dealing with people better as they are in the moments without trying to change them. Because I really believe if I was to define what does love actually mean in a relationship, love means there's room for both of us. And if there's room for both of us, there's going to be tension. Because a lot of times what actually happens, I think, is our thought of love is oftentimes skewed into the world of we become emotional Siamese twins. where we're attached emotionally at the hip. And so we're doing something together that we love, like we're watching our favorite show together, but then one of you wants to go get water and you're offended that they got up to leave because if you're emotionally attached, you got to go with them. Right? Rather than, wait a second, what? Well, if you're emotionally attached as a Siamese twin, you would have to. The point is, don't become emotionally attached to that level and make it a little more freedom of movement for both of you. But it's recognizing a lot of times what we will react to is the way somebody, one of the things that will drive me the most crazy is I'll be talking with a friend or talking with a kid or talking with my wife or talking with somebody in my family about something that really matters to me and it's important. And it usually starts off with a pretty decent dialogue, right? They're engaged to, oh, okay, and they're listening. And then all of a sudden a ding happens on their phone and they grab their phone and check it. Or a kid walks in and they immediately turn and, oh, okay. And so what's the message actually being sent there? Something else, we use the phraseology of they got a better offer. That's kind of the way it thinks. That's the way it feels like. Oh, okay. So now it becomes a dilemma. Because if it's a relationship that matters, what do I need to do? Wait, maybe. If it continues to happen, confront them possibly. Right, because here's the dilemma. When I'm going to confront somebody about this, what am I ultimately wanting them to do? Change to the way I prefer it to be. Well, who says I'm right? That's the dilemma of relationships. That's what's happening in any important relationship. Always. Because there's a truth in there of a phrase I love. I learned this when I was an intern in this profession. Walked into a colleague's office and she had this written on her board. And I'm like, that is fantastic. And the phrase is just simply, you teach people how to treat you. And so if I say nothing about something that bothers me, I'm teaching, ultimately, go right ahead, that doesn't bother me. But if I demand that they change, that's more about me than it is a dynamic. And that's the tension of relationships. That's why I believe there's an element that challenges us to grow in no better way than relationships do. There's more tension there because it comes down to what's being exposed in me. What's this really all about? Is this really a threat to me? Is this a threat to us? Or could I come up with a better way to say, hey, you know what? I don't know if you realize this. Back in my mind, I'm like, I think you know what you're doing, but I don't know if you realize this. I felt really dismissed right there. Then I see what they do. That's a move towards, right? Because a lot of times, what do we want to do when I have to face something that's really difficult? I want to move into it and pin them down so they recognize the error of their ways. I've done that with Pam countless times in 31 years. She needs to recognize the error of her ways so that therefore our relationship is better. Isn't that kind of an interesting phraseology? No, it's so that my side of the relationship feels better. But it doesn't work out that way. So instead, it turns into, how do I get better at standing for what I care about, what's important, what matters, but holding it loosely enough to see how they respond, how they react and respond in kind, and then I see what we do. Because ultimately, I really believe where marriage gets best is, one, I recover better, because things will happen that are going to make me upset or disappoint me or frustrate me, but I can recover better. And then two, there's room for both of us. Because I want a spouse or friends that are their own beings, that are their own people, right? That we can count on, that are living. There was a phrase I came across from a colleague friend that he talked about creating a great cake of life. Right, that was his recipe that he talked about. We want to all try to strive to create a great cake of life. And if I remember right, it was regular strenuous exercise was 1. Whatever I do, do it passionately was 2. And then the third one was have good same-gendered friends was 3. And then if I can create a great cake of life, then my relationships become the icing on that cake. But far too often what we do is we make our relationships the cake. And I put too much weight on another person to help me feel better about me or fill in some void or help make me be part of my happiness committee or whatever it might be, rather than, no, I need to do the heavy lifting that's growing my own character. And so that kind of framework for me, whatever I do, do it passionately, totally changed, back to the way we started this conversation, totally changed the way I now attack the dishwasher issue in my household. Because I'm convinced, I don't have confirmation from my parents, I actually need to ask them this, but I'm convinced I was conceived and then born because they needed somebody to mow the lawn, unload the dishwasher, and back in the day, change the channel on the TV. Because I'd be sitting with them, hey, Corey, can you change the channel to number 3? And I'm like, we are the same distance from this thing. And my job all the time growing up was unload the dishwasher. And so to this day, I still have momentary pings of dread when I see that light on the dishwasher saying it's clean. But what's changed is now how I try to approach it. And I taught my kids this, is we turned it into a game. Because I have come to the understanding that if there are things I have to do in my life that are just part of being a responsible adult among society, might as well have some fun with it. And so I would turn unloading the dishwasher into a game. And we actually did this not too long ago when Sydney was home over the summer. I'd pull out a clock and a stopwatch and say, okay, how fast can we get it unloaded with nothing breaking? That we all lose in that regard. But how fast can we get this thing unloaded? Ready? Go. And I'd hit start and we would just go as fast as we could because it just made it fun. And so there's an element of trying to live life in a better way so that way the relationships I have become more the icing on the cake. And that also means marriage. Marriage is an important part of our lives, but we are still our own individuals in the midst of it. Because all of this happens in the context, all of our growth happens in the context of the differences between maintaining myself while holding on to a relationship. You guys see the tension points immediately inherent in this? Because I married a woman, I was raised in a household. One of the family of origin traditions was when you're on a road trip in my parents' house, well, let me just be honest, in my dad's car, if we're on a road trip, you don't get out of the car until you get to your destination. Okay. Even if it said destination, because at the time when I was learning this tradition, we lived in Friendswood, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston, and his parents lived in California. And so we would drive straight through to California. And I still vividly remember, most of the time my father would like to leave, our normal departure time was 7, 8, 9 p.m. He would drive all night long, which was fine with me because I could sleep, wake up, and get most of the day gone. And so one day I wake up, and I'm like, Dad, I got to pee. He's like, okay. And I'm watching. There goes a gas station. I'm like, Dad, I got to pee. Yeah, we'll get one. There goes another one. Yeah, like he's trying to get it as far as he can because the gas gauge wasn't quite low enough to warrant the stop. That was the tradition. Well, then I carried that forward. And I marry a woman, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but when she talks about what are the historical markers? The running joke is, oh, historical marker, let's stop. Because she knows Corey's not stopping at that. But it kind of becomes this joke because to Pam, part of the joy of travel is the adventure of the travel. Now, I see several of you on my camp shaking your heads like, no, that is not why we travel. We travel to get where we're going. So one of the things that wigged me out the most, that actually was probably one of the best things I could have done, was several years ago, we got an RV. So we got a fifth wheel. And our very first trip was to go to Dauphin Island, which is an 11-hour trip. That's nothing. 11 hours, that's an easy drive, because we would drive 15 without even dropping a hat with our little kids too. Well, we took 3 days to drive the 11 hours. Yeah, it was killing me. The first night we stopped, I've been driving like for 3 hours. I'm like, really? We're stopping already? I was just getting warmed up, right? I was just getting in the groove. But we stopped and we had a fun evening. And then we woke up the next morning and the kids swam at the campground we were at. And then we got loaded up and we drove another 3 or 4 hours and we did it again. Only this one was a fishing place. And like, okay, so we fished all evening and we had a good dinner and we hung out and we woke up and we had breakfast and we swam a little bit and then we got there. And it actually, that second or third morning, it was actually like, okay, this is actually pretty nice. I won't completely give up on my old way of doing it, but there's a tension that's at play between us, because I'm married to a woman that loves to adventure. She's a higher desire adventurer than I when it comes to travel. The trouble becomes, I think I've mentioned this already, the trouble becomes she's the lower desire of planning said adventures. And she wants me to do it. So there's a tension that happens. So it's just realizing that's what happens in the way we relate to each other. Because we have preferences. We have what we want. I mean, for some of us, your ultimate day could consist of multiple TVs, football games, or something with doing absolutely nothing. Where you're probably married to somebody that's like, tolerates the first part of that, and then after they reach a point of like, okay, enough's enough. That's a tension point we can have, because when sports are on, I'll be watching some football game, and she's like, who's playing? I'm like, I don't even know. I'm like, why are you watching it? Because it's sports. And used to, she'd be all upset and sit there and watch, upset. Now she's like, yeah, I'm not going to watch Idaho Tech take on Montana's School of Hairstylists or whatever it is. I'm like, but it's a good game. No, it's not. It's 31-0. Yeah, but they could come back, you know. But it's just this, there's a tension that happens. And so then what happens in those instances, she's like, I'm going to go do something else. Where then I would sometimes go, no, we're supposed to be together. That's what's going on internally. But instead, it's like, okay. Because what's being exposed in here is nothing going wrong. It's just a tension between us. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. That comes down to what vehicle we're driving. That's a joke. If we're in the RV, we stop a bunch. But no, so it just, a lot of times now it just becomes trying to have better conversations about what expectations are, what preferences are on said trip. Because sometimes, I'm painting her in a way, sometimes it's like she gets it. We're just going, let's go, because she wants to get there too. But sometimes it's like, no, this is a more meandering time. See if this makes sense. When we fly, I'm different than I used to be, but I have always been one that I want to be the last one to board the plane, because I want to be on the thing as little as possible, because I just don't enjoy the experience of flying. I'll do it, but I just don't really enjoy it. I'm married to a woman that believes TSA's framework is important and matters, and you should be there at least 2 hours early so you're there. Okay. And so the tension point on how we've resolved this, as I don't remember what trip it was, because it was just you and I. It was the day before, and she's like, when are you planning to head to the airport? And I'm like, well, what are you thinking? And I love it because she's like, if you would like a less anxious wife, I would prefer to leave at this time. I'm like, okay, I can make that happen. And so then I tried to figure out, how do I now adjust to where I can figure out ways to have fun on this journey. And so I have realized real quickly how much fun people watching at an airport is. You talk about a high anxiety environment and what you see come out in people, that's actually quite comical and fun and psychologically cool. The way I work is kind of watching people. Oh, okay, I see what's going on there, So it's just there's a tension that just happens and you just navigate it as best you can moment to moment. Can't really answer the question completely because it varies according to the situation. But there's an element of realizing within this dynamic of conflict, there are things being exposed with both of us. And when you can see that in your relationships better, what happens is an opportunity to actually start aligning with each other on things. Because this becomes a scenario where what we have tension about, hopefully then, is not personal. It's something between us. You guys see the difference? You see it different than I do. That's not a character assassination going on. That's just different. I mean, one of the clients I had years ago, he was raised in the military, where there's that framework of if you're 15 minutes early, you're on time. And that, am I wrong with that? Okay. And then if you're 10 minutes early, you're late. And if you're on time, you missed it completely or something like that. That's the way he was raised. Well, he did not marry somebody that was raised that way. Shocking. Right? Because what do you think happens most of the time on who we choose to marry? Somebody that's going to just get under my skin just enough to expose some things in me. That's just what's going to happen. So we were having a conversation in their session about how do you get to church on time? And when I brought up the idea of what if you took separate cars? She about lost her mind. Anybody want to know why? You want to guess why? Tradition. What was that tradition? What would that tradition say? We go to church together as a family. So unpack that for me then, ma'am. Are you not at church together? You're just arriving at different times. Oh, so it took her a while, but it started to make sense. And so what was interesting is it only took him maybe 2 or 3 weeks of leaving on his own, of just being willing to leave, because he didn't want to just go by himself. He didn't like that idea either. Because think of how awkward that turns into a conversation with the greeters. Where's your wife? Okay, you could throw her under the bus, or you could not in this moment. Everybody see the dilemmas. This is what happens because everything we choose to do has consequences in some way, shape, or form. And so it only took like 2 weeks for him to lighten up a little bit. Not much, and maybe a minute or two. But she also recognized, okay, I have power to go on my own. But she all of a sudden found herself getting a little more engaged sooner. And so it didn't always work out, we go together, but it took the tension out of making it personal, where it was just something that was happening between them. And now you figure out, how do I want to collaborate with this? Or not? Because the key to a collaborative relationship or a collaborative dynamic in a relationship is, I can only handle my part of it. If they don't want to collaborate with me on it, I can't do it for them. That is not solving the problem. Yes? Okay, so what has been found interesting is in all of this, I have yet to ever use the word compromise. That's what she's saying. Okay, so can I elaborate on why I don't like using the word compromise? Yes, I can elaborate on why I don't like using compromise. Because most of the time, the way compromise, in my opinion, plays out in marriage is it's caving. It's not true compromise. Most of the time, we're caving because I just don't want the tension. So I give in, but I haven't honestly given in without holding them responsible or hostage for my giving in. There's the big difference. It's similar to picking your battles, but it's more about, I do believe compromise exists in marriage, absolutely. But compromise really only exists when I am making a choice and I'm only holding myself responsible for that choice. If I later on say, well, you were the one that wanted that, that was not a full-on choice. That was a little bit of a dig. That was a shot. And that's the way married life plays out. Because we are all exceptionally good at hitting each other, metaphorically speaking. And so a lot of times the whole idea of compromise, I like it in the concept of what I really prefer the word collaborating better, because it's more in my realm. It's more I draw a circle around me. I deal with just me, and I want to collaborate. And if I need to choose, and we'll negotiate, we'll talk through. But ultimately, I still have to choose. Did you have a? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Yeah, I hear what you're saying completely, because a lot of times I think what happens is we want relational solutions for independent things rather than what I believe fully is marriage works more on me than I ever could on it. And so ultimately, when I think of the word selfish, I oftentimes, probably 90% of the time, when I hear people say the word selfish, I want to look at it as a continuum of, because 90% of it, I think it needs to be self-care of, am I living according to who I am and who I want to be? Then there's an element of it that is truly detrimental to somebody else. Let me go a different way. That didn't come out. It made sense in my head. Then when I heard myself say it, I lost myself. Um, a lot of times when I think of the word selfish, I'll come back to you in just a second with it. A lot of times the way I hear the word selfish most often is like if Chris and I are in a conversation, I'm like, Chris, you're being so selfish. Well, I'm wanting him to stop doing something I want him to do, which is in and of itself me being selfish. Right? So instead of that, I think selfishness gets a bad rap in some ways, because I don't think if it's to somebody's detriment, that's a problem. But if it's a possible solution to some tension point to expose what's really going on in each of you, because then ultimately I think what it does do is it can bring somebody together, because they realize, why am I holding on so hard to a time? Does it really that matter? Is it really that important? And if he can go through that wrestle and come to an understanding of, yeah, I can turn towards this because it matters, or a lot of what we do in relationships are independent anyway. You think about it, right? I mean, we do a lot of things separately, but we want to align and be alongside together. And so that's constant. I like to play in that tension point, but I hear what you're saying. I just don't have a real answer for it. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Well, we're showing who we are all the time, if you think about it. And so I keep coming back to the golden rule of love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind is the first. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself, which presupposes there is a Carla, a self. That's how I sacrifice it. That's how I give. That's how I actually love. I give. I have something to give. And I think us as Christians, we flip that sometimes, where selflessness is the sacrifice rather than, wait, is there actually a self I am sacrificing, or is it more I'm just giving in, I'm just going along to get along, I'm just following what I've always done? I mean, that's what's being exposed in a lot of the dynamics. And what I believe strongly in is when I can see myself better, I all of a sudden have a better way to face whatever's in front of me. Sure. Well, the posture of each person, yes, that's what helps define, is this something that's heading towards a possible solution and way to solve something or not? Um, but if you think about it, how many elements of married life and life together in a family are you in lockstep with your spouse? Like actual one brain with? Not a lot usually. There's variances, there's little things that are just different because you just care different than they do about it. Doesn't mean you don't care, but you care different. And so it's recognizing there's an element of what happens in life that's why I keep coming back to the idea of what's being exposed in me, what am I challenged to do to show and demonstrate this matters, this is important, and the choices I make are relationally driven as well as individually driven. And sometimes they're going to lean one way or another. But the goal still becomes, how am I cleaner with my choices? Because let me wrap it up with this. We've had a lot of different times over the years on our podcast or in my office that I've had where people are coming in wanting to actually be told what they should do. Right? Because we all hit points in life where it's like, someone just tell me, please. Okay? Please tell me. And what's interesting about that is if we ever actually did, if they weren't already in line with that, they wouldn't follow through with it. Because there's something about us that, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about. I'll go find somebody else that can tell me what to do better. But I think the undercurrent of a lot of this, I'll own me. The undercurrent of a lot of the times I wish somebody would just tell me what to do is if it goes wrong, I just want someone else to blame. If it doesn't actually get what I'm hoping, I just want to be able to blame Pam. If she said do that, that would solve it. I'm like, no, it didn't. So instead, I love the idea of what am I being challenged to face here? What is going on with me? And when I can get better at defining it, seeing it, now I know better what I'm up against. Like here's just a quick little aside. The last week and a half, I have been in this funk in my personal life. Just kind of been withdrawn and kind of down and just off in some ways. And it struck me. I was at a band concert with its marching season with my high school senior, and so I was at his last UIL band show, and I'm watching it, and halfway through it, I'm in tears. And because it struck me, I think I'm grieving. And once I got that word out in my mind and actually said it, there was a different feeling that kind of came across me. And then I was able to go, okay, that fits it too. Ooh, that fits it too. And I was able to start to make sense of it. Rather than what we often do when things go haywire is I just look for everything else that could be going on that is not about me. Rather than, no, what's being exposed here? And so Pam was gone all weekend up with our daughter in Kansas. And so when she was driving home, I was like, I think I'm in a grieving process. And she's like, that makes sense. Because she's probably seen it. It just couldn't maybe label it either. But it's just kind of recognizing that's what's going on is life exposes things. Relationships expose things. Because I think that's where God shows up in the manner in which we face it. Because he meets us where we are. And I think he helps us then learn to love, learn more character, learn to give, learn to sacrifice, learn to serve. because that's where relationships get really good. Because when they're collaborative, I just do my part. And I get better at facing what I'm actually facing. And I figure out what I need to do next. Because all of married life, you can boil it down to this, and we'll close out with a prayer. You can bury married life. I just said bury married life. I heard myself say it. I'm like, that's not what I had up here. You can sum all of married life up in the framework of when I'm in the midst of whatever's going on, my job is to get a better picture of what's going on and then make a move. Whatever it is, turn towards it, speak up, own my part, whatever it could be. And then I see what my next move is after I've made that. We want a roadmap. Do step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3, here's step 4. But in reality, all it is what's my next best move? What's my next best, wisest move? And then I see what comes at me, and I figure out my next. That's life on life terms. Okay? Glad to see you guys tonight. Let's close out with a prayer. Father, we thank you for your love, your presence, and your desire for our lives to be with you, that we can see you more and more. Father, I just pray a blessing over the relationships that are here. May you be the center of them. May you be growing us and changing us and molding us into more Christ-like and more seeing you in all that we do. In Jesus' name we pray.